So Felix,
I think he has some problem in connection, but still, you are live.
okay.
Yeah, it looks like net is unstable.
Dr. Martin, you are live right now.
Okay, okay, good. I will share my screen to show my presentation.
Give me 1 second. I will just
Sure,
introduce you
okay.
first. Yeah, give me a second. No, it is not yet live. There is some problem. I'm just waiting.
But there is a display here. It shows that
No, not yet. Yeah, now it is done. Redirecting to the YouTube. Perfect. 1 second.
even me can see the view stream on the YouTube.
All right, so let me go back. All right, good morning, everyone. Today we have Professor Martin Zimmer talking on mangroves at 11 a.m. Next, forthcoming in this series is Guru Raja KV will talk on frogs at 3:10 p.m. today, post-lunch. And then at 5 o'clock, we have Kailash Chandra talking on animal diversity, so please stay tuned. Let me introduce Professor Zimmer. Professor Zimmer is a group leader at Leibniz Center for Research, that is ZMT, and professor of mangrove ecology at University of Bremen in Germany. He earned a PhD from Albert Magnus University of Cologne in Germany. I'm sorry, it's not Bangalore, it's Germany. Cologne, of course, is in Germany. And he's also a member of IUCN SSC Mangrove Specialist Group. And he's a nominee of federal government of Germany as expert of IPBES and associated member of United States National Science Foundation Georgia Coastal Ecosystems Long-Term Ecological Surveillance Group and research program that is also called GCELTER. And his talk is about the wise mangrove conservation and restoration. So let me stop sharing my screen now. And yes, a warm welcome, Professor Zimmer, to our talk series. Mute your phone and you can start talking now.
Okay, I should be unmuted now. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you online through this format and to talk to you and later on discuss with you about the whys and hows of mangrove conservation and rehabilitation. I will not go into too much research and science here. I will rather talk about mangroves from a higher perspective, larger perspective, and introduce essentially two concepts of conservation and rehabilitation as a starting point for the discussion. Felix sent me a couple of questions yesterday. I will try and include them in my presentation already and start giving some answers. But of course, we can also talk about this later on after the presentation. So most of you probably know mangroves quite well. You heard about them. Most of you probably have been into mangroves. That's why I can keep it rather short and superficial here. I just want to stress the fact that mangroves grow in the tropics and subtropics more or less all over the world, which of course means, as you can clearly imagine, that we don't have mangroves here in Germany. So one of the questions whether we can grow mangroves in the garden is a very clear no here in Germany, but we will come back later to that point for the cases where the climatic conditions are appropriate. So on a global scale, we split mangroves into two realms, two biogeographic regions, which we call the Atlantic East Pacific, which is the area of the Americas and the west coast of Africa. And this is relatively species poor, this area. We have less than 15 species. In many forests, it's no more than 2 or 3 species of mangroves at the same time or at the same place. In the Indo-West Pacific, the IWP, we have the core, the center of mangrove diversity, in total more than 60 species. And in many places, like in Indonesia, in Singapore, Malaysia, we have 15, 20, 25 species of mangroves in one mangrove patch. So this is quite diverse. I would just like to show you around the world to places where my group is working or has been working, and show you some pictures to exemplify the diversity of mangrove appearance. So let's start on the west coast of Central America, in Mexico, and this also more or less directly leads to a question that Felix sent me. These are very arid regions, and the mangroves there consist of three species. The trees stay relatively small, 1.50 meters, maximum 2 meters, sometimes even much smaller than that. And the fascinating fact is that when you go there, you see the mangroves on one side, and then 5 meters apart, you see desert vegetation. So the question that Felix posted was whether Avicennia, one of the species or one of the genera of mangroves that is very common, can grow in deserts. And in fact, they do not really grow in deserts, but of course they can grow at several places in the world in very arid regions. And the very simple reason for that is that they get their water through the tidal inundation. So they can grow there as long as they are tidally inundated frequently. And with the water of the tides, they get all the water they need, plus, and that's a problem for many mangroves, plus the salt in the seawater. So they take up the water, including the salt, and then secrete the salt again through their leaves, which takes a lot of energy. This is why they can make it in these areas where they only get the seawater, but they stay small, they stay stunted because it takes a lot of energy to secrete the salt. Other species or other genera, like for instance Rhizophora, you will see pictures of that species or that genus later on. They also take up the water from the tidal inundation, so they can also grow in kind of arid regions, but they're much more sensitive to salinity because they prevent the salt in the water from being taken up, and that costs even more energy. So at very high salinities, as we can find them in very arid regions, high up in the intertidal, they cannot make it because it would cost too much energy to prevent all the large amount of salt from entering the plant. We move down a bit to the south. We stay in the Americas, actually in the Caribbean, on a small island of Colombia called San Andres. We find the very same 3 species of mangroves, but you see the difference. This is a very luscious environment, almost freshwater in this case. And here the trees grow large, huge trees of 30 meters or more in beautiful mangrove forests. And keep in mind, these are the same species as we have seen before. And a bit further south in Brazil, around the equator, just south of the Amazon mouth, the same species again, and again, large forests. And here you see how soft the sediment, the substratum of these forests are. You have to walk through channels to get to your research areas, and you will always sink in deep, hip deep in the mud of the mangroves. And that answers the question, or one of the questions, whether mangroves are hard substrate or hard bottom environments, and they are certainly not. We do know some very rare cases where mangroves grow on kind of a rocky environment, consolidated sediment beaches with crevices. There, some of the species, for instance, Rhizophora species, can grow by growing the roots into the crevices of the hard bottom, but usually mangroves are very soft bottom environments. And this makes them so special and so difficult to work in. We stay in the Atlantic East Pacific and go to the west coast of Africa and Senegal, another rather arid region where the mangroves are very close to the savanna, to the steppe, with enigmatic vegetation like the baobab. The mangroves themselves grow very dense, but also small. They are rich in birds, are very rich environment for wildlife, and are just another impression of how mangroves can look. Again, back to the global scale, and now we walk from the AEP to the IWP, and we start on the southern distribution limit this time in South Africa. Even though it's a southern distribution limit, the mangroves there can still grow quite big. So here you see like a very enchanted environment with the same genus of species, but different species, the same genus of mangroves, but different species. They grow in different shapes, so it's very entangled, very rich in crab fauna, in high density, as you can see in the burrows down here, and often close to salt marshes, where we have this mix of mangroves and salt marsh vegetation. We stay at the southern distribution limit and go way to the east to South Australia, and there we have the real distribution limit. So further south than this point, mangroves would not grow. And here we have only one species of mangroves. In most cases, in the northern and southern distribution, this one species belongs to the genus Avicennia, because they're very robust, and we heard before, they can live in arid environments, they can withstand cold or low temperature. But then in these regions, the trees are not very dense, they stay small and stunted, as we have seen before. But staying in Australia, just a couple hundreds or 1,000 kilometers further north, again, very luscious forests, rich in species, big trees, and very dense vegetation. Two more examples: Fiji, the islands of Fiji, where we also have extremely dense mangroves of, in total, about 10 to 11 species. And you see on the upper left, the genus that I mentioned before, Rhizophora, with these prop roots. For most people, this is the image of mangroves, very dense. And you can also see the size of these roots, where you can walk through dense vegetation on the forests, on the river bank, and inside huge amounts of young recruits that will rejuvenate the mangroves upon the death of the old trees. The last example, very close to the center of mangrove diversity, actually, this is Singapore. And you can see on the upper left a sketch from a forest where on this photo alone, you see, I would say, 7 to 8 different mangrove species. Excuse me. So the mangroves there are very diverse, very rich in species, not only the flora, the vegetation, but also the fauna is very rich there. But as in many other places in the world, the mangroves there have a problem, especially in Singapore. They are very urban, very small, and restricted by the growth, by the development of the settlement. So some of the mangrove patches there are just very small and don't give much space to the species, even though they can be very diverse. So just an impression of how diverse the mangroves can be. And when we look at this, we may ask the question, if they're so diverse, do they have anything in common? And yes, of course they do, otherwise I wouldn't ask these questions. And these things they have in common are the ecosystem services, the goods and benefits they provide to local people, to regional societies, and of course also to humankind worldwide. And we'll go through that in a second with the next slide. I just want to quickly remind you of the question that we need to ask if we want to protect mangroves. And these are the questions that my research group actually tries to answer. So what are the ecosystem processes that go on in the mangroves that lead to these ecosystem services? And which are the players, the key drivers, both in the vegetation, in the flora, and in the fauna, and also in the microbiota and the sediment, for instance, that drive these ecosystem processes. So here I list a couple of ecosystem services that are commonly known for mangroves, and I won't go through all of them, and there's many more. I will just highlight some that I consider most important from my perspective, and these are also the ones that my research group works on. So the first that is mentioned very often is habitat for wildlife. Yes, mangroves provide a rich habitat for rich wildlife. I personally do not consider that an ecosystem service because it's not concerned about humankind. This is just something that a habitat usually does. Any kind of ecosystem, any kind of habitat provides space and living for the wildlife. But important is, of course, as mangroves are forests, they provide a lot of wood and other fibers for local people. And you can see here that this look is logged either small scale, which then is not a big problem, or on a large scale, which might then cause a problem for the mangroves because clear felt areas might have difficulties in redeveloping, in recolonizing or being recolonized by mangroves. The wood is used for constructions by the people, for houses, for boat jetties, or in this case, as we can very often see in Brazil and also in Fiji, for fish cages, for catching fish. But it's also used, and then it might be clear cut and taken from the mangroves on a large scale. It's also used as firewood, or in this case, it's even burned for producing charcoal that is then sold on a larger market, sometimes even an international market. Another important ecosystem service is the production of food. And here it says other than meat, but of course meat or fish, seafood is a very important part of it. So hundreds, thousands of fishermen in a single coastal stretch depend in their daily living on the fish, on the seafood that is linked to mangroves by catching either in front of the mangroves for fish, shrimp, or going into the mangrove and catch, for instance, crabs that they then either use for themselves or sell on the market. But in many regions of the world, the fruits of the mangroves, the seeds or seedlings, are also used as vegetables in the daily kitchen routine on the menu of many people. Shoreline protection is certainly one of the most visible ecosystem services and benefits that mangroves provide. And I won't go much into that, but you can just imagine with these trees growing right in the middle of the water with just tiny little bit of wave movement, these mangroves with these entangled roots very clearly slow down water movement, slow down the force of the water that hits the shore. And by this prevents erosion, prevents the removal of shorelines, protect the stability, and by this protect the people living in or just behind the mangroves from storm surges, and in extreme cases, even from tsunamis. Even though the mangroves themselves might be destroyed or will be destroyed by that, but the people living behind them might be protected from very strong storm surges. And of course, the last point, which is important on a global scale, mangroves accumulate and sequester climate active gases, or at least the carbon and the nitrogen that would be otherwise be released as climate active gases like carbon dioxide, methane, or dinitrogen oxide. And they are stored both in the biomass of the mangroves above ground in the tree, but below ground in the roots also, and in huge amounts in the sediment below, where they are stored under very stable saline and anoxic conditions for centuries and even millennia, and be taken out of the atmosphere. Which means that if we lose mangroves, then these gases or these climate active gases would be or will be released into the atmosphere and will even increase the effect of warming through changes in the atmospheric chemistry. Nonetheless, even though we know how important mangroves are, they are threatened worldwide. We have an ever-increasing, ever-growing population side worldwide. About 3 billion of people worldwide live in coastal regions, especially in the tropics and the subtropics, where mangroves grow and potentially help people make their living. And all these growing population and their effects have a strong impact on mangroves. One of them is certainly pollution through chemicals from industry, from harbors, from production, but also through eutrophication, through nutrients from agriculture, from aquaculture ponds and stuff like that. And in the end, it means that in many cases, it very soon will happen, or already did happen, that the mangrove become a mangrove because the trees just die off from pollution or a surplus of nutrients. Aquaculture, I mentioned before, it's an important income for many people, and small-scale aquaculture and ponds might not be a big problem for mangroves. We are working on finding solutions for that. But large-scale aquaculture, where huge areas of mangroves are cut down to build aquaculture ponds, then after a couple of years, these ponds lose their productivity, or diseases spread in these ponds and they cannot be used, they are abandoned. And in other areas, new mangrove areas are cut down and new ponds are built, while the old abandoned ponds are not connected to the sea anymore and are difficult to be recolonized by mangrove naturally. So here we would have to help mangroves recolonize with suitable rehabilitation processes. Funny enough, in many areas, people did cut mangroves over the last decades in order to give space to build protective constructions for protecting their coastlines, which is kind of funny when you take into account, or when you remember, that mangroves themselves protect the coastline very well. But it happens to build harbors, and then along the harbors to build these constructions to protect the coastline. Roads are very important as a potential impact on mangroves. Of course, for us, when we do research and we cannot reach the mangroves by boat, it's a huge facilitation for us to get into the mangroves by the road. But you have to take into account or remember that these roads also change the hydrodynamics in the mangroves and might have a very negative impact on the mangroves. And last but not least, especially for people in Europe and in the US, in the Western so-called civilization, people like to go to these exotic places, as we call them, to tropical coast areas and enjoy their holidays. And these people want to see white beaches and blue water. They don't want to see mangroves that are stinky and muddy, or they're perceived as stinky and muddy, although they're not, because they're really beautiful environments. But they keep the people from seeing the beach, from using the beach, from seeing the blue water, because the water is not that blue in most cases. It's murky, it's turbid, even though they are beautiful. If you have a closer look, many people don't want to see them. And for tourism, huge areas of mangroves are cut and are lost for a very long time. So just to summarize this, and this is a relatively recent table, but there's even more recent numbers available now. We have on average an area loss of a bit less than 1% of the global mangrove area per year. That doesn't sound much, but if you imagine if we go on like that, it would mean that in about 100 years, there will be essentially no mangroves lost. This will not happen, we hope, because we are working against it. We need to protect mangroves, but what do? We cannot keep humans out of the mangroves. Mangroves are part of the living for many people. Well, this is just a tourist show that I'm showing you here, but many people really, as I showed you before, make their living out of mangroves. So we could, of course, potentially just keep them out and close the mangroves down, lock them down. But we cannot do that because, as I said, these people need the mangroves. They make their living of it. And also for tourists, for instance, they might even become a very valuable income source for local communities, for local societies. And this would be lost if we lock them out, the mangroves. So what would we allow? Which uses can we allow? And which threat and which intensity of threat we can accept if we still want to protect mangroves? We have to some degree. So we mentioned artisanal fisheries, for instance, as one of the uses of mangroves. And I think we all agree that people going to the mangroves, collecting seashells, shellfish, using cages to catch some fish for their own use, that would not be a big deal. But how about fishing trawlers, industrial fisheries? How about aquaculture? Do we want that? Can we allow for that in the mangroves? When it comes to logging, to which degree, to which extent can we allow for logging and still keep mangroves as a healthy and functional ecosystem? Leisure time use, canoeing, bird watching, hiking is certainly not a big problem if it's done in a sustainable way. Hunting certainly is a bigger issue here. And then all the motorized and more high-tech use of mangroves might be a big deal. And then even worse, when people really leave the water and would go into the mangroves with motorbikes or quads, which probably is not even very easy, but it might be fascinating for people to do. Can we allow that or can't we? And last but not least, industry. In many areas, people depend on some kind of industry, but how and to what degree can we allow this to happen next to mangroves? So we have to make decisions which kind of use we can allow and in which areas we would allow this use and what the threats of these uses would be. We try to work in this direction, and now I will not, as I said before, not go really into the research. I will just give you a brief overview of what we are doing. So we go to the field, we take samples there, we get dirty, we get muddy, but then we take these samples, here a sediment core, for instance, taken in a mangrove in Brazil, and then we take these to the to the lab and try to work as clean as possible because we want to extract DNA, so-called environmental DNA, to analyze the community, which animals, which plants, which microbes are there and do their job in making the ecosystem run, drive all the ecosystem processes. And we also extract and analyze the organic matter in the sediment to understand better what is going on there, because many of these sediment processes are an essential background and fundament for many ecosystem processes and services going on in the mangroves. So the questions that we are, for instance, interested in first of all, what are the environmental conditions that the fauna in the sediment or in the mangroves in general need? And what are the effects of the fauna on ecosystem processes? So which of the faunal elements are the most important drivers, are the key drivers in these ecosystem processes? And of course, also extremely important, what are the socioeconomic values, the relevance of the mangrove fauna as food, for instance, for local people or for a small scale market? We need to understand that, and this is part of the research that we are doing. But mangroves are not isolated. They are growing just in the connection, just in the transition from sea to land in the intertidal. So they connect the marine environment with the terrestrial environment. They exchange material, organic matter, nutrients, and organisms with the sea and with the hinterland. So it's also very important to understand this connectivity to be able to protect them really efficiently. You have seen that some of the mangroves are very dense, and if you ever tried to get into there, especially if you try to get into there to do research, you may realize that it's very tough, very difficult to enter. This is why we more and more start using remote sensing, be it through satellite imagery or through drones that then take photos that we analyze later on. And this is just one example of a study of colleagues from ours with who we collaborate, where they did drone flies over mangroves, and we did something very similar later on together with them in Fiji. They analyze the spectra of the images they get and can come up with very detailed, very high resolution maps of mangroves. In some cases, we can even distinguish different mangrove species. In other cases, it's still very difficult to do so. But the reason we do that, and this is a map with a different coloration to show you the outcome of this research, with red colors on this satellite image showing we have a high degree of change, in most cases loss of mangroves, whereas in other regions in yellow or green, and you see that the green areas are very little, we see medium to low change rates. So if we do this remote sensing repeatedly over some time as a monitoring effort, then we can follow, without always going to the mangroves, we can follow the change in area and then deduce what that means or might mean to the ecosystem and to the people living around and from that. So with all this information from the sediment, from the satellite image, from lab and field studies on the effect of fauna, we get an idea of the species of the community composition in the mangroves. And again, without going into any detail here, we can then map mangrove communities, not only the plants, but as I said before, also the fauna and even the microbiota in the sediment that are very understudied in most mangrove areas all over the world. And with this map of the community and knowing which species or groups of species are key drivers of ecosystem processes and ecosystem services, we can then even map ecosystem services on a regional scale and make predictions on which services might be provided in the future. And this will be the basis for really better understanding and making important decisions about how to conserve mangroves, or if this is not possible, how to rehabilitate them. I think I talked about the whys so far, and I think it became, in the given short time, became relatively clear why we need to protect mangroves. So now is the how. So why do we do all this? Why do we do all this research? And the information is kind of summarized on this slide. Based on what we are doing, we do have information about the community composition. I didn't show you how and why, but we can get information about the community composition in the past. We know it at present. We know the environmental conditions at present. We can deduce from some environmental sampling the environmental conditions in the past. And we do have predictions from colleagues from other scientific areas about environmental conditions in the future. We know which communities provide which services to some degree at least, and taking all this together and making predictions and forecasts, we will be able to understand and to map the mangroves of the future. So where will which mangroves grow? Where will we find which species? And this will help us a lot in determining and in driving the future of mangroves. So what we propose here, and this is one of the concepts that I wanted to present to you, is the traffic light concept. This is the attempt to make it relatively easy to understand, especially for policy makers, for decision makers, to understand where mangroves or other ecosystems, if you apply it to other ecosystem types, are important, are valuable, where we should protect them. So we categorize different ecosystems, different mangroves in this case, into 3 groups, which we then just color like a traffic light. So the red ones would be the ones that are very valuable, and according to our understanding, we predict that they will remain valuable but delicate to disturbance, to stress. They're very sensitive. So these areas we need to protect. We need to protect them strictly, which means there's no use allowed whatsoever. Of course, we cannot do that for all mangroves, even though some environmentalists would like us to do. But as I showed you before, people need mangroves. They need to use mangroves for their daily living. So we need to provide alternative areas to these people. And these alternative areas might be the yellow areas. They are still valuable. They are high in value for the people, but according to our predictions, they are and will be resistant or resilient to disturbance and stress. In these areas, we can allow for sustainable use by local communities, by local societies. The green category in the end would be those mangroves that are either lost already, where the environment is totally degraded and probably difficult to recolonize for mangroves. They are invaluable from an ecosystem perspective, or they will soon be because they're almost degraded. This is a very controversial point, and I've had many very controversial discussions with environmentalists who, of course, don't like the idea that we give areas free for open use. But these would be the green areas in our traffic light concept. And open use, of course, is not a total open use, it's still relative. What we are saying here is just if you need to build a harbor, a port somewhere, then don't build it in this red or yellow area, but just move it a bit, a couple kilometers maybe, to another place where we say this is a green area and you can do it. The same for a hotel. If you want tourism, if you need tourism and you need to build a resort, ideally for ecotourism, then do it in a green area where the value of the mangrove is very low already. As a theoretical example, this is an area in northern Brazil where we did quite some work over the last couple of years, or actually the Institute over the last decades. It's, as I said, a theoretical example. We have a red area on this little peninsula, which would be highly valuable, and we actually do know it's highly valuable. We do not yet know how delicate or sensitive it is to disturbance, but this area would be totally protected. Next to it, the yellow one is a peninsula that is still valuable for the people, provide many fish and crabs and some firewood or wood for building the cages the fishermen use for catching the fish. But it's sensitive and we want to protect it, so we allow some use of the area, but it's protected. And this is actually already implemented there. It's called an extractive reserve, this peninsula. So that means that it's a protected area, but local people are allowed to go and take out resources to some degree. Now the green area would be very close to the next city with a harbor, and the whole estuary would already be kind of degraded. The ecosystems are not very healthy anymore, and they might be lost in the next future. And this is the area where then, according to the traffic light concept, we would say, if you need to develop anything, industry, tourism, whatsoever, this would be the area to do it, because here we lose less than if you went to the red or yellow area and developed your industry or your tourism there. The alternative to opening the green area to free use, of course, would be a kind of rehabilitation. The problem with restoration or rehabilitation, at least in the case of mangrove, is that over the last decades, it simply didn't work out very well. It's relatively recently only that feasible concepts of mangrove restoration and mangrove rehabilitation have been developed. So we are getting better, but still in many areas, the success rates are still very low. And this brings us back to one of the other questions that Felix posted yesterday, whether we can plant or restore mangroves through plantation of propagules, and what it means, how long it would take for these forests to develop. And according to our knowledge, mostly from areas in Indonesia, or in Malaysia, we have some ideas that a mangrove takes 30 plus years, so 30 to 40 years to really grow back into a mature forest. So after clear cutting, it takes 30 or more years before we have a mangrove that is really functioning. That was just a side aspect to answer one of the questions. The point that I want to make here is that another important aspect of restoration, the classical restoration, is that in most cases, the focus lies on the ecosystem, on the structure and biodiversity of the ecosystem. So restoration efforts try to recreate, to re-implement, to rebuild ecosystems that are very similar as possible to what we had before. Now we come up with a new concept that is called ecosystem design. And there the focus lies on the humans living in and from the ecosystems in the area, being in need of taking out resources for their daily living, for their well-being. So we ask within the concept of ecosystem design, what are the needs of the people? What resources do they need? What are the ecosystem services they need to use? And then we go back to our knowledge about the ecosystem, and we take those species, those sets of species that are the key drivers of the ecosystem processes that result in these ecosystem services. So we take those species explicitly that are known to be the best providers of the ecosystem services the people need, and re-implement mangrove ecosystems that with these species that will provide these ecosystem services in short time. So it's kind of a targeted way of rehabilitating ecosystems within the concept of ecosystem design. So this is just a sketch to summarize that. We have the database on species and their traits in the mangrove or in any other ecosystem. We have knowledge and we build models of species interactions, how their interactions result in ecosystem processes that finally will drive the ecosystem services. We put all this together in a toolbox, which is kind of a software where people can enter, or where the managers, the planners can enter the request of ecosystem services we need and the local, the regional set of species. And the outcome would be the species that need to be implemented in this area to provide the ecosystem services that are mostly needed by local people. It's also, I understand, and I'm very well aware of that, a controversial approach to ecosystem services, but from our perspective, this is an ideal way of combining the environmental needs of restoring ecosystems that have been degraded and cannot be used anymore, and the human needs for the services derived from these ecosystems. And with this last slide, I'm through with my presentation. I hope I could give you some insights into the whys and hows of mangrove conservation and rehabilitation. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Great, Zimmer. Thank you so much, Professor Zimmer. And it's a wonderful presentation. And I enjoyed that your talk from beginning to the end, especially your remark on the tangled root. So probably you're aware that our this 6 days of webinar title of this series is Tangled Bank. So probably the image that most of us, one of the speaker yesterday, Deepa, was telling that her image when we say the tangled bank is a mangrove forest. So it's quite fitting your talk in our space. I was looking at your website. Yes, I was looking at your website, I mean the ZMT, your profile site where the data is mentioned, the data sets of different latitudes and longitudes. And one of the data set is 17 degrees and 96 degree east, 17 north. So probably somewhere close to Sundarbans. So my point is that did you do the sampling in the Sundarbans?
No, not yet. Unfortunately, even though the Sundarbans are among the most famous mangroves in the world, they are one of the, to my knowledge, one of the two largest continuous stretches of mangroves in the world. Unfortunately, I didn't make it there yet, but we are just in the process of starting a big project in the Sundarbans about conversion of aquaculture ponds into mangrove areas. So it's kind of a restoration process. But again, in this context too, we don't just want to convert the ponds into mangrove, but we want to make it still usable by the local people because this is what they need. But unfortunately, I haven't been there, but I'm very curious to see them in hopefully the near future.
And I would like to introduce our HOD sir. Our department head is Professor Paramjeet Singh, and he had been lived almost a decade or more in near the Sundarbans vicinity, and he was director of our Botanical Survey of India for quite some time. Over to you, sir. Professor Paramjeet, you can make some points on this.
Good morning, Dr. Zimmer. It was a very elucidating talk. I think we have troubled you in quite early morning in Germany. I think you have been, but you have been very kind to given this presentation.
Good morning. Nice to meet you. It's not that early. It's 7:30. Well, right now it's past 8, so it's quite okay.
Actually, I had a chance to work very near to Sundarban for almost a decade. Though I was working on different other aspects, but I had a chance to go to Sundarban. It's amazing. I mean, more than 10,000 square kilometer area with more than 4.5 million Indians who are dependent on this. Their economy is dependent on. I mean, and the only mangrove area in the world where tiger is there.
Yeah.
So it's also declared as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. But I mean, you were talking about ecosystem service. It's a living example of that. People have been for centuries. They are dependent on Sundarban, and they're actually, the name itself comes from one of the mangrove species, which is this Heritera, because there's a very good population in the core zone. Forest department is taking quite a good care of this Sundarban Biosphere Reserve, and core zone, they are not allowing any activity there. But buffer zone, and as you are planning to do those pond sort of a thing in buffer and those transitional zones, where actually agriculture and aquaculture is happening in, on the fringes of Sundarbans. And it's very intensive, population is very large. It's a challenge, but at the same time, it shows how fertile, how many ecosystems this harsh climate and living there is very difficult. I mean, you can imagine in tropical area, hot, humid, with salinity very high. Other thing about I have not been to Bangladesh part of Sundarbans, but that's also equally rich. But there was one news about starting. I mean, Bangladesh was going to start a coal-based power station inside the Sundarban. That was something very, very sort of a damaging news for everyone. I don't know what happened to that project. I have not kept. I know you must be aware about all those activities which are happening. Other things, Zimmer, I would like to know. One is a personal question. Are you related to that another Zimmer who is very famous, written a book on, I think, ecologist from Germany? And my second question is that you are a part of IUCN species specialist group. So how many of these species of mangroves, as well as mangroves and mangrove associates, which are under recently worked out for IUCN red listing, or can we do anything in Indian? I mean, whether those Indian species have been covered, or we can do, because I am in orchids species specialist group, but I thought I don't know whether anybody is from India in that your mangrove species specialist group is there.
We do have Professor Katir Razan is
right.
He's in the mangrove specialist group. So let me start answering your questions from the last one, and then I come to the first ones. So the problem with the red list of mangroves, if you wish, where we talk about endangered or threatened species, is that some of the mangroves are quite limited in their range, in the distribution, which makes it difficult to really judge how threatened they really are. I mean, yes, they are threatened, because if the small area that they live in is gone or will be gone, then the species will be gone. But that's a different thing compared to a species that occurs theoretically worldwide and is really going extinct because of human activities. So we do have a handful. I have to admit, I don't know the exact number. We do have a handful of species of mangroves that are considered endangered according to the IUCN Red List. But for instance, one example that has been considered very strongly threatened over years, now we kind of took off the list, because in the end it's not a true species, but it's a hybrid between two mangrove species. And then according to the IUCN rules, this would not apply to a hybrid. So we're in the process of developing that, but we are more trying I think for the last 2 or 3 years now, we are more trying to turn the red list of species for mangroves into a red list of ecosystems, talking about the different types of mangroves that we find all over the world that might be threatened, especially, for instance, estuarine mangroves that might be threatened by ports more than island mangroves or stuff like that. So it goes a bit more, we try to move it a bit more in this direction, from the species focus to the ecosystem focus. The other question that you asked, I'm not aware of any other ecologists in Germany. Well, I wouldn't say I'm famous, but I don't know any other ecologist in Germany with the last name Zimmer, but there must be some. I mean, I don't know all of them, and maybe there's someone you refer to. So I don't know. I cannot answer this question. But your description of the Sundarbans actually make a very good point, and on the processes and events going on there. You're making a very good point, because this very clearly contrasts the activity of local communities, of local societies that have been living with and in the mangroves for centuries, essentially. And their use of the resources coming from the mangroves is very clearly sustainable in itself, because these populations have used the mangroves over such a long time in a give and get, in a very clear association, very close association, that it's obvious that their use is sustainable. It has been sustainable over decades and centuries. And then suddenly we come into these areas and want to improve their benefit. Well, of course, not their benefit. In the end, it's all about our own benefit. So we push them to increase the pressure of fishing, of getting fish or shrimp or crabs out the system. Or we even go and build industries, because there's plenty of water that can be used, for instance, for cooling our factories and stuff like that. And this, of course, cannot be sustainable at all. And I think this is a very nice example where we see how we can use these ecosystems sustainably if we really take care, but how easy it is to get beyond sustainable use by implementing something that is just too strong and too powerful to be borne by the system, and for the system to take and handle, if you wish. So yes, thank you for that example. It very clearly shows the point of conservation, not only of mangroves, of course, it also applies to other ecosystems.
So,
Zimmer, I hope you will be in India shortly, and look forward to see you and meet you in person.
Would be my pleasure. Thank you very much.
so Professor Zimmer, I am not expert in this field, but a little bit I have the curiosity of a few questions to you.
Sure.
So first one is you mentioned the two differentiation of the geographical distribution of the mangroves in the two different regions, AEP and the IWP. So what is the difference in the intensity of the threatened in these two regions? One is with maximum number of the species, this region, and the African region has the less number of the mangrove species. So what is the impact of the threatened with the progress of the, you can say, damaging the ecosystem on these two different type of the groups?
That's a very good question, and I have to admit I don't really know the answer. I don't think. Well, we have these two systems, as you said correctly, with a high versus low diversity, and the interesting side aspect that I didn't mention in my presentation is that there is no species where there's only one species that occurs in both ecosystems. So they're really very clearly distinct. The species that we find in the Atlantic East Pacific, we don't find in the Indo-West Pacific, and vice versa. I'm not aware, I don't think we can very clearly state any differences in terms of the mangrove ecosystems being threatened by human activity or by climate change or any other environmental change we observe right now, based on this distinction, purely based on the species number or diversity. Let me give you one example. In the literature, we often find a link or correlation between the species richness of an ecosystem and the biomass production. In many ecosystems, this has been postulated. I'm not sure how well it has been proven actually, but at least there is this idea, this conundrum that high diversity means high productivity, low diversity means low productivity. We know many mangrove areas in the Atlantic East Pacific that are as rich in biomass and have as high growth rates as the species rich mangroves in the Indo-West Pacific. So we are still in the very beginning of understanding why this is the case. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it might not be that easy to say, well, these species-rich ecosystems in the Indo-West Pacific are more resilient or more resistant to stress and disturbance than those in the Atlantic East Pacific. It might be very tempting to assume that according to what we find in the literature. But in the case of mangroves, I'm not, based on the knowledge we have nowadays, I'm not convinced this is true. The problem really is that mangrove ecology going in this direction of research is still very young, is a very young discipline. We know so little. We still, after decades of research, we still know very little about mangroves compared to other ecosystems. So I cannot really give you a very clear answer here.
So second question is regarding the traffic light concept. You mentioned very well about the peninsula of Brazil, I think so. So now, can on the basis of this traffic light concept, we can differentiate the different countries on the basis of their mangroves in their coastal areas?
You mean different countries, meaning different policies, how this relates to this concept?
Yeah.
I think we would need to adapt this concept to the local settings of the different countries, because all the local or the national legislation and the legal background of conservation and use are so different among different countries that I would not go for any generalization there. So I would just take this concept and go to a given country and adapt the concept or adapt the outcome of this concept to the legal situation of this country, where there in many countries the legal background is already strong enough to implement such a concept. And in the end, the idea of the traffic light concept is not so much directed towards the legislation and the legal background. It's more directed towards making decisions about where to do what easier for the policymakers, who in many cases are not scientists. So they rely on the scientists providing information that they then need to make decisions. And this is kind of the idea, that we make it simple. We just have these three categories, and then these three categories would have to be adopted to the national legislation, to the regional or national circumstances.
So one more question,
Sure.
but Professor Zimmer. So in ecosystem, you can say designing of the ecosystem, there are so many drivers. So socio-economic development or the conservation, which one is the major which determine the ecosystem designing?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. This is actually you really hit the nail. This is the critical point of this concept.
Thank you.
I have to say we are just in the very infancy of developing this concept. This concept is just a couple years old. So I came up with it like 3 or 4 years ago, and we are still developing the backbone of it, if you wish. So the critical or the essential point that we have to take into account is that we need to understand the socioeconomic, the socio-ecological background, we need to involve the local people, the local stakeholders in all these decisions that we have to make. So it's not us going there and telling people in a given area, these are the ecosystem services you need, and these are the species we need to re-implement for you. But it's always the dialogue. We have to go there. We have to talk to the local stakeholders, to the people. We need to understand their needs. They need to tell us their needs, and many of the needs will be conflicting, will be competing interests actually. And we always have the ecological interests, the environmentalists who want to protect the nature, the system as well as possible, as strongly as possible, and we have the socioeconomic needs, and we have to find a compromise that satisfies both sides. Having said that, it sounds very simple, but I'm well aware how difficult that is, and how full of potential conflict this process will be in many areas. So yes, you're totally right. We have to take both sides into account, and we have to find a way, as I said, of satisfying both aspects as well as possible. It's never an optimum. For none of them, it will be an optimum, but the compromise might result in an optimum in the end.
So a viewer asked a question, Vishal from the Kolkata, regarding your presentation. According to him, can we protect the mangrove forest biodiversity post-cyclone Amphen? Please suggest some scientific views.
Okay. Okay. Of course, the cyclone has a strong effect on the ecosystem. But again, if you look at the ecosystem, I think imagine we left the ecosystem in peace, just as it is, then these ecosystems will restore themselves, if you wish. They will recover from the disturbance, because even though the cyclone is unusual, it's the strength might be unprecedented, but still it's kind of a natural phenomenon. The frequency and the strength that we observe right now is not natural anymore. It's kind of indirectly man-made, but the cyclone itself is a natural phenomenon. And it destroys ecosystems, yes, but ecosystems will recover from that naturally. If you want to foster or improve the recovery of the ecosystem, well, to be honest, I'm not sure this is feasible, and I'm not even sure it is advisable to do that. But it depends again on the use and the needs of the people living in the area, how much they need. So of course you can help the ecosystem in recovering, for instance, by some very carefully done reforestation or rehabilitation measures. But whenever possible, I would just advise leave the ecosystem in peace and let it recover by itself.
Great.
Yeah, very interesting discussion, Martin, and especially on the traffic light. I've never came across that concept earlier. So yes, thanks Vinay for pointing out that is very interesting concept. So finding a balance between development as well as conservation is extremely important, like the Swedish concept, the Largom, you know. And one of the interesting questions that we have a participant named Shikarni Datta. By the way, this view is live on the YouTube. It has been watched by 1,500. So I'm very happy to see that many participants are watching it live. Yes.
Okay.
So Shikarni Datta is asking a question: policy change and approaches for the conservation of mangrove forest in Southeast Asia. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, we are, of course, we always try to directly talk to policymakers, decision makers. This is part of our job, even though as scientists, it's sometimes difficult. So we need mediators. But to answer the question, it's very difficult to really come up with suggestions on a very general basis. It's all local and regional aspects that we have to take into account. So we are usually very careful with generalizations. But of course, I mean, in general, what we are trying, well, now I said general, even though I said we should not generalize, but what we are usually trying to do is really to go to the place, take the local situation into account, talk to both sides, both the local stakeholders and the policymakers, and then help them with a scientific background that we, together with local scientists, of course, develop and provide, help them find this compromise between use, ideally sustainable use, and protection. I know that this does not sound very satisfactory because it is a very vague approach the way I phrase it. But if you go and take this approach and adjust it, adapt it to the local situation and to the local regional legislation and governance, then this will be, from my point of view, this will be the approach, and from my perspective, the only viable approach. You always have to adapt and take both sides into account. I'm not sure this answers the questions and satisfies the person who asked, but this is on this very general level, this is the only answer I can give.
Exactly, this is a kind of a vague question, so definitely your answer is the most plausible answer to that question, I would say. I agree with you. Now, and a couple of questions more. One question is by Dr. Ahmad Abdul Halim Khan is asking a question. What causes vivipary in mangroves? Is this an adaptation?
That's a tough one. Yes, of course, it is an adaptation to not so much to the intertidal environment, but more to the distribution of the way of distribution of the seeds of the propagules. So first of all, within the different families of mangroves, we see a very clear trend that mangrove species usually have much larger seeds than terrestrial species from the same family. And we see this, we interpret this in the light of vivipary. So vivipary, for all those who might not know, means we are viviparous. So we give birth to a living offspring. We don't lay eggs. Most plants have seeds that then at some point fall to the ground and they start germinating. Vivipary in plants, like in many mangroves, means that the seed already starts developing and germinating when it's still on the tree, before it falls down and is then distributed. The advantage of this is that once it is distributed and reaches an area that is suitable for settlement, it will be much faster. And we believe that this is actually the driving force, the selective force behind developing vivipary, because the seedlings of most mangrove species essentially are distributed by water, by ocean currents along the coasts. So as soon as they are washed ashore by the tides and reach an area where they can settle, they are then ready to develop in this area very quickly, much more quickly than they would be without vivipary, and settle in this area and stay there, even with the tidal currents coming in and going out again. So in a nutshell, yes, I would very clearly consider vivipary in mangroves an adaptation to the coastal environment, let's say.
So one irrelevant question due to the present crisis. So how could Germany manage itself in this COVID-19 pandemic situation, doing much better as compared to all others country? Russia has the low number of the death, but more number of the cases. But Germany has a less number of the death as well as the less number of the cases as compared to other European countries as well as the African country, America. So
of course, now I'm getting way outside my expertise because I'm not a virologist and I'm not a politician either. But I think the reason, and I have to say, I'm really very happy about that, of course. The reason we managed so well, I guess, is that we responded very quickly, or still early enough, to the upcoming threat. As soon as we had the first cases in Germany, the government developed concept, and one of them, of course, was the lockdown. So I think compared to other countries, the lockdown in Germany was much earlier relative to the infection history of this disease. And I think, and this is now I'm talking as scientist again, and I think the reason for that is that our government listens to scientists. Our chancellor is a scientist herself. She's a physicist, so she understands the relevance and the importance of scientific knowledge, of scientific background for decision making. And this is why I think she is very well willing to listen to scientists. And this is just an advice that And I just recently read it even in the news that now other governments start, or other countries start arguing, maybe it's a good idea to have more scientists in your government, and or at least listen to scientists better than many governments do. And I think this is one of the reasons why Germany does so well.
So I heard somewhere here that some countries are sending the sample for the testing to the Germany. So how could you do mass testing in a very short time? Actually, we are struggling with the testing. Actually,
The point again is, to the best of my knowledge, in the beginning, I think we still don't do the real mass testing as other countries are trying to do. So before you go and get a testing, then you really have you have to have a very good reason for being tested. You either have to have the symptoms, and if you just say, well, I don't feel well, and I might have been in contact with a person who has the virus, it's not a reason for being tested. They will not test you. So you either have to have the symptoms, or you have to have been in very close contact with a person who has been proven infected by a test. So this is, of course, we do a lot of tests, but for me, this is still not the mass testing that other countries are trying to do, or actually are doing. So many people in Germany would have liked to be tested, but they were refused being tested because they were not really in the group of people that are supposed to be tested.
Great. Zimmer, it was a very nice interaction to you. And on the behalf of me, thank you.
My pleasure.
And, Zimmer, I agree with, I totally agree with your point that we need really a science-based decision making. And I'm really happy about Angela Merkel, your president, the chancellor, of course. And I recently came to know that she's holding a PhD in chemistry. She was basically a scientist, and then she turned into politics. Fantastic. So probably that has contributed in something.
Give me 1 second. I just need to charge my computer. Please. I'll be back in a second.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I just needed to plug it in. Yes, and again, I think this is a very important point, and I'm, as a scientist, I'm very happy about this, because I really think that our political, social, ecological, societal decisions should much more be based on science, on the knowledge that we get. Right.
Over to Professor Paramjeet. Sorry, sir.
I'm there. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Zimmer, for such a elusive. I think another factor, just continuing with the discussion on COVID, other factor is, I think Germany has got a very good social health system.
Yeah.
Backbone is very strong, and when cases come, I came to know that they have been taken well care of. I mean, you are always ahead of the problem which was coming. And of course, another problem, other aspect which is coming into light at international level is people are saying that wherever women are in charge of the countries, those countries are doing better. So that way, Merkel is not only a scientist, she's a woman, she's more empathetic. She has more empathy, and she can maybe those are the two good combination. So, but we are also, I think, reaching the peak now, and we hope that our country will also start. And we have already started unlock process 1. And Zimmer, with such a nice deliberation and something which is very close to my place of work earlier. I was fascinated to see the overall view of mangroves which you have given, and how you are contributing at the global level to this very important subject, very important group of plants, though they are not botanically related, those group species, but they as a group, they are very interesting. All are sharing similar co-evolutionary tendencies. Thank you, Zimmer, for enlightening all the students and us, and we look forward to have more deliberations with you, more interactions with you. Thank you, Zimmer.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk to you and to have a global audience on YouTube. And it was my pleasure. I hope we interact again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zimmer. And
Thank
for the participants, so we have got our next presentation coming, and this is Guru Raja KV will talk on frogs at 3:30 p.m. So post lunch, please be there. And then comes the forthcoming talks in the series is Kailash Chandra. He is the director of Zoological Survey of India. He is going to talk on animal diversity at 5 o'clock in the evening. And tomorrow morning session is by Varad Giri. He's going to talk on snakes, endemic snakes of India and Western Ghats. So tomorrow at 11 a.m. So please tune back in, and goodbye all.